In front of millions, the unthinkable happened. Prince William stood, hand raised, as the Archbishop spoke the words no one expected. Camilla's expression, drained of all color, was caught in a silent, haunting close-up that instantly went viral. This wasn't just a coronation. It was a coup. But what triggered this live television bombshell? And why did Camilla look as though she'd just witnessed the destruction of everything she fought for? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The broadcast had opened with all the pomp and tradition expected of a royal ceremony. Viewers across the globe tuned in, expecting to witness the reaffirmation of an aging king's rule. Trumpets echoed, camera lenses flashed, and the regal atmosphere filled screens and hearts alike. The media had been fed a careful narrative. Charles would appear briefly to bless the occasion, then retreat, citing fatigue. But something was already off. A missing protocol, a misaligned schedule, subtle changes the veteran royal correspondents picked up instantly. Still, no one anticipated the announcement that shattered the ceremony's delicate fade. As the camera panned across Westminster Abbey, viewers saw a quiet murmuring between bishops and aides. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward, but instead of reciting the expected script, his voice shifted in tone. Today we welcome a new sovereign, one who steps forward in this hour of necessity. The words were carefully chosen, yet unmistakably historic. As he turned toward William, standing upright in full regalia, a silence swept across the room like a thunderclap. Even the choir faltered for a split second. William didn't look surprised, he looked prepared. Camilla, seated prominently and visibly poised for a ceremonial role, suddenly stiffened. The camera lingered just long enough to capture her complexion fade, her hands clench, and her lips part in disbelief. It wasn't just the world that was watching it, was the world watching her crumble. The once mistress turned queen consort, now sidelined by an act of royal defiance no one had seen coming. Her face, typically guarded and composed, betrayed something deeper: betrayal, fear, and fury wrapped into one chilling moment. The press gallery erupted. Journalists scrambled for statements, phones buzzed non-stop, and live news tickers spun in real time with increasingly wild speculation. Was Charles dead? Had he abdicated quietly? Or worse, had he been forcibly removed from power behind the scenes? With no official word, the media grasped for meaning in every flicker of movement, every hushed whisper among the royals. William remained statuesque, his eyes fixed ahead. Not a glance was thrown toward Camilla, who now sat as an accessory to a monarchy being rewritten before her very eyes. Inside the abbey, gasps and murmurs grew louder. Even long-serving courtiers who had seen decades of royal drama appeared bewildered. Some shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged glances with widened eyes. Nothing like this had occurred in modern memory. The sacred continuity of the crown had just been hijacked on live television, and no one knew what came next. But this public spectacle was only the final act in a secret war raging behind palace walls, a war Camilla thought she had already won. For years, Camilla was the silent architect behind the throne. With Charles aging and increasingly withdrawn, she seized opportunities to expand her reach. But that ambition came at a cost, one she never expected to pay live on air. As whispers of her control turned into outright resentment, the palace began to split from within. Behind closed doors, the balance of power was shifting. Charles, once resolute and vocal in his duties, had begun to retreat from the public eye more frequently, citing fatigue and health issues. In that vacuum, Camilla stepped forward not as a caretaker, but as a decision-maker. It began subtly at first, a rescheduled engagement here, a carefully phrased press statement there. But those close to the monarch noticed a pattern. Every royal decision seemed to carry Camilla's imprint. Schedules were altered to suit her preference. Events that once placed William and Catherine at the forefront were redirected or quietly removed. Even Charles's speeches bore the unmistakable tone of someone else's voice, as if his authority had become borrowed, filtered, and staged. Whispers began to circulate among staff. Trusted advisors, some of whom had served the crown for decades, were dismissed or conveniently reassigned. In their place, unfamiliar names emerged, all curiously loyal to one woman. These weren't just staffing changes. This was an erasure of institutional memory. People who knew the old ways, the Queen's ways, were systematically replaced. One insider described it bluntly. She wasn't waiting for the throne. She was already rehearsing it. The press noticed too. Camilla's presence in official briefings became more frequent. Her voice louder, her shadow longer. But outside the palace, the image remained polished, flawless even until it wasn't. Within the family, fault lines deepened. William and Catherine had grown wary. What had once been a chilly distance now became pointed resistance. Decisions regarding state matters were made without consultation. Royal duties were reassigned under vague excuses. William, known for his restraint, watched carefully as Camilla's influence turned into dominance. And yet he said nothing, at least publicly. Camilla mistook his silence for weakness. She assumed the heir lacked the ruthlessness to push back. That was her fatal error. As Charles's health visibly declined, murmurs of concern became harder to suppress. His public appearances grew rarer. When he did emerge, his speeches were shorter, his demeanor detached. Camilla insisted he was simply overworked, but even veteran courtiers could see it. He wasn't just tired. He was being controlled. The king was present, but no longer reigning. And as Camilla continued her ascent, she became blind to the resentment festering around her. She believed she had secured her legacy, but in truth, she had sparked a rebellion. Because as Camilla tightened her grip on the throne, she unknowingly set in motion a plan decades in the making, crafted in silence, executed with precision. He wasn't just the dutiful heir. Behind closed doors, William had begun assembling a quiet resistance. His inner circle trusted military aides, legal experts, and one royal confidante who risked it all met under total secrecy. Their mission, protect the crown from being reshaped in Camilla's image, even if that meant challenging the monarch himself. While the world assumed William was biding his time, performing ceremonial duties with grace and discipline, something far more dangerous was unfolding beneath the surface. The erosion of royal tradition, accelerated by Camilla's expanding dominion, had awakened in him a sense of duty that went beyond inheritance. This wasn't about ego. This was about survival. The monarchy, as the late Queen envisioned it, was slipping into something unrecognizable. And William, who had learned from the shadows of Diana, from the caution of his grandmother, and from the silence of his father, was no longer willing to watch from the sidelines. He began where trust had once been forged, the Queen's former advisors. Men and women long removed from the front lines, their influence dormant, but their loyalty unquestionable. Meetings were arranged under code names and off-record locations, private estates, borrowed cottages, even decommissioned military buildings. No paper trails, no digital footprints. Only whispered conversations and plans locked away in memory. Together they built a framework not of rebellion but restoration, a return to core values. But even this resistance was walking a dangerous line, because what they were compiling, files, records, testimonies, wasn't just about Camilla's sway. It was evidence. Evidence that, if leaked, could implode the monarchy or crown a savior. Each week more came to light. Instances of overreach by Camilla's camp, funds redirected, protocols ignored, correspondence intercepted. It was subtle, calculated, but it reeked of something more than ambition. It smelled of control. And as the files grew thicker, so did the weight on William's shoulders. This wasn't a chess game. It was a war without declaration, and the next move could shatter everything. Still, amidst the shadows, there stood Catherine. She said little, but her presence never wavered. She became his anchor, his mirror, his quiet strategist. While William walked the tightrope of loyalty and rebellion, Catherine reminded him of the legacy they were protecting, not just for their children, but for a nation on edge. Then came the moment that changed everything. An envelope, sealed with wax, delivered without fanfare by a royal courier long thought retired. It bore the insignia of the late Queen Elizabeth. Its contents? Unknown to all but a chosen few. But when William read its message, his resolve hardened. The letter didn't just echo his fears, it validated them. Elizabeth had seen the cracks forming even before her passing. And in her own subtle way, she had passed the torch not to Charles, but to the one she believed could weather the coming storm. But even with all his planning, William couldn't act until fate delivered a shocking opportunity that no one saw coming. Just weeks before the live event, King Charles vanished from public view. The official story claimed exhaustion, but insiders whispered something far more unsettling: conflicting medical reports, erratic behavior, and Camilla refusing independent assessments. When the truth slipped through the cracks, it forced William to make an irreversible move. It began quietly, almost forgettably. A royal luncheon postponed. A speech at the Commonwealth Summit cancelled. A sudden absence at a state ceremony brushed off with the familiar excuse of fatigue. But it wasn't the cancellations that stirred concern, it was their frequency and the eerie silence that followed. Clarence House issued statements dripping with ambiguity. Buckingham Palace echoed them without clarification. And soon, the narrative began to twist. Was Charles truly resting, or was something being hidden? Behind the gilded gates, confusion turned to chaos. Those in the king's inner medical circle, physicians bound by confidentiality and tradition, found themselves locked out of key briefings. One, a long-trusted doctor who had served the royal household for over 2 decades, reportedly raised red flags about discrepancies in the king's health records. He was promptly dismissed. No explanation. No appeal. Just silence. It was then that a pattern emerged. Camilla, once merely the queen consort, now presided over engagements with a commanding presence. Her face filled the pages of the press. Her voice guided the palace's message. Her hands, it seemed, held the reins of power. And yet, the man wearing the crown was nowhere to be seen. The media, ever watchful, began to take note. Commentators who once praised Camilla's composure now raised concerns about her overreach. Had the monarchy become a one-woman show? Was the king unwell, or had he been hidden? Then came the leak. An anonymous letter, allegedly from a nurse inside the royal residence, shook the foundation of the carefully maintained fade. "The king is lucid," it read, "but he is not free." That single phrase spread like wildfire. A monarch conscious, aware, and yet silenced? It was the kind of revelation that history remembers not as rumor, but as reckoning. William had remained patient, cautious even, but he could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. He requested access to his father not as a son, but as the heir. He demanded transparency. He wanted truth. But what he received instead was deflection, delays, and ultimately, denial. The palace machine steered, some believed by Camilla herself, closed ranks. William, once a figure of royal decorum, now found himself forced to choose loyalty to silence or protection through action. He chose action. Because there comes a moment when waiting becomes betrayal, when watching becomes surrender. And William, having uncovered the strings being pulled in the shadows, refused to let the crown be transformed into a puppet show. The monarchy, once teetering between image and integrity, stood at the edge of a cliff, and someone had to pull it back. With his father's fate uncertain and the monarchy at risk of becoming a pawn, William knew the clock had run out. The crown had to be protected even if it meant breaking tradition. While the public slept, a legal operation decades in the making was activated. Hidden in the fine print of royal protocols was a mechanism one last used centuries ago. It allowed for a sovereign to be legally bypassed if deemed incapacitated or coerced. And William had just the evidence he needed. In the labyrinth of royal law, buried beneath ceremonial traditions and archaic language, lay a single clause so obscure it had almost faded into history: Clause 37B of the Royal Assent Protocol. It was a fail-safe, a relic of a time when monarchs could be manipulated, imprisoned, or ruled by proxy. It stated that if the reigning sovereign was found to be under duress or medically unfit to serve, a formal petition could be raised to the Privy Council to invoke a lawful bypass. It had never been used in modern times. But that didn't mean it couldn't be. And now, with mounting evidence and the monarchy's credibility teetering, William saw it as the only path forward. The case wasn't just emotional, it had to be legal, verified, indisputable. William's team, now operating under the radar with near military precision, assembled their arsenal, redacted communications, dismissed doctor testimonies, internal memos showing contradicting health claims, and the now infamous leak from the royal nurse. Together, they painted a chilling portrait not of a dying king, but of a living one who was locked behind gilded walls and stripped of autonomy. But it still wasn't enough. They needed one final piece. A living royal. Someone who had seen Charles's condition firsthand and was willing to testify, not to the public, but to the institution itself. And that's when Catherine turned to the one woman who had remained silent through it all. Not out of fear, but principle. Princess Anne. Known for her discipline and loyalty to the crown, Anne had stayed removed from the drama. But privately, she had grown uneasy. Charles's isolation, Camilla's assertive maneuvering, the public's growing unease, it was all too much to ignore. When Catherine approached her with the files, she said nothing. But within hours, she agreed. Her word would carry the weight of royal history. She would not speak to the press. She would not attend a hearing. But she would appear quietly, behind closed doors before the council, and confirm what William needed confirmed, that Charles was no longer acting of his own volition. That night, under the veil of darkness, a rarely invoked council protocol was initiated. A private session of the Privy Council was held away from cameras, fanfare, and interference. Legal precedent was cited from archives centuries old. Testimonies were delivered under solemn oath. Every detail had to be perfect. There could be no room for speculation, no space for public backlash. It had to be airtight. When the vote was called, the room held its breath. The outcome, unanimous. If Charles did not appear publicly within a defined time window, the crown would pass by legal authority to his heir. It was done, quietly, strategically, and with a resolve that stunned even those who cast the votes. William, still grieving the weight of what it meant, received the official confirmation by dawn. All that was left now was the broadcast, the public ceremony, the visible shift of power. The moment the world would realize the king they thought they knew had already been replaced. With every document signed and sealed, all that remained was execution live, before the world, with Camilla watching helplessly. No one told Camilla. As the live broadcast began, she assumed the show would proceed as rehearsed. But when the Archbishop stepped forward and turned to William, her mask slipped. It was betrayal public, devastating, and irreversible. Cameras zoomed in as her world crumbled before millions. From the moment she arrived, Camilla radiated control. Her entrance was deliberate, her posture impeccable, her expression composed every inch the queen consort she believed herself to be. To her, this was merely another symbolic occasion, a ceremony of stability in a reign she had helped curate behind the scenes. She had spent years crafting her presence at the heart of the monarchy, pushing boundaries that once seemed untouchable. And now, she thought, she was reaping the reward. But what she didn't know was that the entire stage had been reset, and she was no longer at the center of it. The moment the Archbishop turned away from her and addressed William with a voice that echoed not ceremony, but sovereignty, everything shattered. The air changed. The rhythm of the room shifted, like a storm had entered mid-prayer. There was no warning, no whispered signal, no sideways glance, just the declaration, clear, unambiguous, and final, that the crown was now resting upon a new king's shoulders. William didn't hesitate. His expression was solemn, steady, and absolute. And beside him stood Catherine, calm and luminous, offering only the faintest nod, one that told the world this was no accident. It was execution. And it was flawless. Camilla's reaction rippled across social media within seconds. A still frame of her face, once filled with confidence, now drained of life, went viral before the ceremony even ended. Viewers around the globe gasped as she sat frozen. A mixture of confusion, disbelief, and raw fury etched across every inch of her body. What had been choreographed to elevate her legacy had become her undoing, broadcast live in high definition. Royal guests turned to each other in stunned silence, unsure whether to stand, clap, or pray. Even seasoned courtiers, trained to remain unmoved through chaos, could not mask their astonishment. A new monarch had just taken the throne, and the woman who thought she would guide it had been pushed into the shadows without a word. And then came the digital explosion. Within moments, hashtags surged to the top of trending charts. Camilla's collapse, Queen no more, and white as a ghost flooded timelines. Screenshots captured the precise second her face paled, her eyes widened, her lips trembled. Commentators who once praised her as the steely force behind Charles now questioned everything. Had she known? Had she tried to stop it? And more chillingly, what would she do next? But the live humiliation wasn't the end, it was the spark that ignited a royal wildfire. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Camilla, blindsided and betrayed, unleashed her fury. Staff were fired, threats made, and accusations hurled. But the palace was no longer hers to command. As doors closed around her, one truth became clear. Her era had ended not with a crown, but with a cold shoulder. The moment the broadcast ended, Camilla tore through the inner halls of the palace like a force of nature. The smile she wore just hours earlier had vanished, replaced with a seething rage that gripped every word, every breath. She demanded answers, none came. She barked orders, none were followed. When she told security to bar William from entering the king's private wing, she was met with silence, and then refusal. The hierarchy she believed she had constructed was crumbling beneath her feet, and the people she once commanded now looked through her, not at her. It was more than humiliation, it was erasure. Word spread quickly within the palace walls. Staff who had stood by her side for years suddenly found themselves dismissed without explanation. Those she suspected of disloyalty, real or imagined, were gone before the hour passed. But the power she once wielded had slipped through her fingers, and the institution that had once feared her influence now seemed indifferent to her wrath. In one private corridor, her scream pierced the marble silence, a furious clash with Charles's chief aide, whose loyalty had long been questioned. What was said behind that door has never been officially revealed, but sources say she accused them of treachery, of orchestrating the coronation behind her back. The reply, whispered with calm certainty, broke her spirit. "You did this to yourself." And where was Charles? Sedated, isolated, unreachable, kept in a carefully controlled medical wing with limited access, even to her. Whether he knew what had unfolded was unclear. Whether he approved, even less so. Camilla's requests to see him were met with vague replies, all pointing to the same reality: her proximity no longer guaranteed her power. She turned to Catherine, hoping for an audience. Perhaps a last plea for clarity, reconciliation, or leverage. But Catherine, ever composed, declined the meeting. She simply said through her aide, "The Queen doesn't need a confrontation. She needs peace." The final blow came quietly, with devastating precision. Princess Anne, the royal family's silent sentinel, approached Camilla in the Queen's retiring room. No emotion, no dramatics. Just a single sentence, spoken like a closing door: "It's done." With those words, Camilla's campaign, her ambition, and her crown dissolved into memory. There would be no reversal, no redemption, no return. Her reign, brief and controversial, had ended not in death, nor abdication, but in deliberate isolation. But what no one expected was Camilla's next move, a whisper campaign that threatened to bring down the monarchy altogether. Camilla once believed her destiny was set in stone. But as the dust settled, she was left alone in a palace filled with memories that would never become legacy. And yet those closest to her say she is not done, not yet. For a woman who played the long game once, could she rise again? In the weeks following the televised upheaval, Camilla vanished from public life. No statements, no photos, no ceremonial waves from balcony windows. She retreated to a remote royal estate rarely spoken of, and even less frequently visited. The silence was deafening. Her inner circle, dwindling by the day, reported that she refused all communication from senior royals. Not even Charles's handlers, still guarding his fragile reality, could reach her. She had been pushed out not by decree, but by dismissal. And perhaps worse, by indifference. Yet outside the palace gates, the narrative began to split. For some, she became a tragic figure cast aside after decades of loyalty. For others, she was the architect of her own downfall. Headlines wavered between sympathy and scorn. Analysts dissected her every move in hindsight, re-examining old interviews, resurfacing quiet rumors, and questioning whether she had ever truly been fit for the throne. But somewhere, behind that cloak of silence, something darker was brewing. Whispers of a tell-all began to surface. Sources close to the publishing world claimed a ghost-written memoir was already in motion, crafted not as an apology, but as a weapon. Camilla, it seemed, had not accepted defeat. Friends who had once dined at her table spoke, off record of a chilling promise she had made before leaving the palace. "They've written my story for me once. I won't let them do it again." That vow, uttered in bitterness, carried the weight of someone who had not just lost power but purpose. The public remained torn. Was she the royal consort who stood beside Charles through scandal and storm? Or the calculating figure who reached too far, too fast, and paid the price? Opinion pieces flooded the press, and online discourse ignited into war. But the fire burned hottest after one photograph leaked a private meeting between Camilla and a foreign press magnate with a long history of controversial expos. The meeting's content remains unknown, but its implication was unmistakable. Camilla wasn't fading. She was regrouping. And as for William, the man who dethroned the Queen's shadow, his reign was only beginning, and the past was far from buried. With the crown now firmly on his head, William faced a kingdom in turmoil. His first decree would define not just his reign, but the monarchy's future. And what he chose to do next stunned even his closest allies. It wasn't vengeance. It was something far more dangerous: forgiveness, on his terms. The nation waited in suspended anticipation. Days after the shocking coronation, William finally emerged not from the throne room but from a simple podium facing the press and the people. Cameras rolled, reporters whispered, and the world leaned in. What followed was not a victory speech nor a warning to dissenters. It was a call for renewal. "A new chapter begins," he said, his voice steady, not with erasure but with reckoning. He wasn't there to gloat, he was there to rebuild. And he knew that rebuilding required more than declarations. It demanded confrontation with the ghosts of the monarchy's fractured past. In the weeks that followed, sweeping reforms were announced. Legacy audits, public disclosures, a full transparency initiative into royal finances, charities, and ceremonial expenditures. The monarchy was no longer going to operate behind velvet curtains. And perhaps most shocking of all, William extended a gesture of unexpected mercy. Camilla, though removed from power, would be granted safe passage, full legal protection, and would retain limited honors. Not as a queen, but as a royal widow. It was an act that confused some and infuriated others. But it wasn't for her, it was for history. William wanted no martyr, no exile. He wanted closure. The media couldn't agree on the meaning of this gesture. Was it strategic brilliance or a ticking time bomb? Opinion columns ranged from awe to outrage. Some called it the mark of a true king, one secure enough to extend grace. Others called it naivety, believing that Camilla's silence was only temporary, and that a reckoning still loomed behind her polished reserve. But while the press speculated, William and Catherine moved quietly. She departed on a goodwill tour across former Commonwealth nations, restoring frayed ties with empathy and diplomacy. Her presence, elegant and unwavering, sent a clear message. The monarchy was no longer a cold relic, it was human, present, and listening. Then, just as the dust seemed ready to settle, something surfaced. A sealed document, signed by Charles, dated weeks before his final disappearance from public view. Its contents were withheld, its implications undisclosed. But its timing was unmistakable. Whispers hinted at a final confession, or perhaps an admission of pressure. Whatever it was, it had not been released. Not yet. And William, now king, held it under lock and key. Not as leverage, but as a final, buried truth that could alter everything, if ever revealed. Because in the House of Windsor, crowns are worn not just on heads but over old wounds and new wars. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.